Chapter 12. Armies meet. Much of Ethiopia exists above 6,500 feet, a fact that goes a long way toward explaining Ethiopia's ability to resist incursions from the outside, whether they be zealous followers of the Prophet Muhammad in the 16th century or Europeans in search of empire in the 19th century. The high elevation and rugged terrain inspired some visitors to dub Ethiopia Africa's Switzerland. The analogy was useful in countering the common European misconception of sub-Saharan Africa as a vast, damp, leafy jungle, the Congo writ large, but it brought confusions of its own. Ethiopia largely lacks evergreens, and it certainly lacks chalets and lederhosen. In late February, before the rains resume, the high valleys and prairies of Tigray share a palette of tan, gray, brown, and black. When the dry season ends, heavy rains work the land, cutting breaks, ruts, and ravines. When the Italians marched west from their camp toward Adwa, they traversed a landscape that was a broad plain in essence, yet intricate in detail. Only two real paths crossed west from Saria, leading respectively to two passes across the mountains, separating the Gundapta plains from the town of Adwa. As they headed westward, a range of peaks loomed in the distance, the rugged snowless profiles of three of them, Ishasho, Rayo, and Samaita, served as markers for the soldiers' destination. Baritari's plan was simple. The army would advance in three columns, followed by Baritari's and his staff, and a fourth reserve column led by General Elena. The three columns were to take up positions holding the two passes over the mountains. General Jabramida's column, the army's right flank, would move to occupy the northern pass between the peaks of Eshasho and Rayo. General Albertone's column, the army's left flank, would move to occupy the southern pass between the peaks of Rayo and Samayata. General Arimondi's brigade, the army's central column, would occupy the ground in between the western flanks of Rayo. The advance would take place at night to minimize the risk of detection and ambush. Militarily, the march would accomplish a number of things. First, it would reduce the distance between the two forces. When the Ethiopians awoke on the morning of March 1st, they would find the Italians dug in at a very strong position at the passes, a mere 5 miles to their east. Such an aggressive move, although falling short of an actual attack, would make it difficult for the Ethiopians to refuse to give battle without losing face. Second, it would put the Italian forces in the dominant position on high ground. The ground leading up to the two passes, the terrain Ethiopian forces would have to cover if they moved against the Italians, narrowed as one approached. This meant that the Ethiopians would have to approach the Italians on a funnel-like climb. As they neared the passes, fatigued and slowing from their climb, they would present compact targets for Italian riflemen and artillery. The plan had its limitations, however. The passes are narrow, and it wasn't obvious that the Italian forces would be able to fully deploy themselves there. Arimondi's column, in particular, would have to take up positions between the passes on the saddle of the western edge of Mount Rayo. Could the Italian forces array themselves successfully in such uneven and confined space? Much would depend on execution. And then there was the problem of communication. The brigades were ordered to remain in contact with one another and with Baritiri throughout the march, but the fact that three brigades would advance on two separate paths meant that one of them would have to trail the others. As it turned out, the Arimondi Brigade had to wait while the Albertone Brigade advanced, putting them hours behind. There also seems to have been some confusion among Baratieri's generals about the objective of this movement. Baratieri's plan called for an aggressive movement, a provocative advance, not an attack. The hope was that it would induce the Ethiopians to attack the Italians at last in a position that played to Italian strength. And even if the Ethiopians didn't attack, such an aggressive move would end the stalemate, salvage Italian honor, and prepare the moral ground for subsequent retreat. It might even precipitate Menelik's retreat back to Shawa. Giuseppe Menarini, a captain of a Bersaglieri unit serving under General Dobromida, remembered meeting with the general on the eve of the army's advance. Dobromida entered, looking rather preoccupied. He barely responded to his officer's salutes, which was unlike him, and his somber expression made Manarini wonder whether a passing illness had returned. Dobromida removed his cap and sat down, putting his elbows on the table. He wiped his face with his hands before turning to Colonel Cesare Araghi. Araghi, we're not retreating anymore. We are advancing. Our movement begins this evening at 9 o'clock. Was Dobromida having second thoughts? Advance by moonlight. Orders to move out were not communicated to rank and file soldiers until the last possible moment, to minimize the risk of tipping off the Ethiopians. By the time the officers spread the word to prepare to move out, some of the soldiers had already turned in for the night. Others were just sitting down to a late dinner. Ernesto Cordella was an artillery officer. He was ordered to Eritrea in December 1895, after the disaster of AMBW. When he arrived at Sauria on February 27th, the ascent from Massawa had taken 12 days. He and his men were assigned to the 3rd Mountain Battery, commanded by Captain Edoardo Bianchini. A feast to celebrate their arrival was planned for the night of February 29th. Umberto Massotto, the brigade cook and emeritus chef in difficult circumstances, had put together a pasta dish that was judged altogether ingestible. The call to move out interrupted them just as they were about to enjoy their evening meal. They gobbled down what they could, mounted their artillery pieces on the backs of their mules, and began to move out. Francesco Frisina had shipped out from Naples on Christmas Eve aboard the Marco Minghetti under circumstances more solemn than most. Like Cordella, his unit was dispatched to Africa in the aftermath of Ambalage. The Minghetti arrived at Massawa on January 30th, and his group reached the encampment at Sauria in mid-February. On the evening of the 29th, having just barely settled into the camp routine, he was enjoying coffee and cake when the call to arms was trumpeted at 8:30. Like the others, he and his men were told they wouldn't be gone long. They left their camp intact. Carlo Diotti, a corporal in Dobromida's brigade, had already returned in for the night when he was called out for a brief speech by Major Secondo Solaro, commander of the 14th Infantry Battalion. "Boys, the time for chatter is over. Tomorrow morning, it's combat." Another soldier, who lived to tell the story of the battle, believed that the plan called for a sneak attack on the Ethiopians. Such confusion about what was happening did not bode well. At the rank of major, Solaro was just a step or two away from Dobromida himself. Corporal Diotti had the conviction that he and his comrades was about to attack the Ethiopians. As Diotti and his comrades saw it, General Dobromida was itching for a fight. but Major Solaro confided to Dioti that he didn't share Dabromida's rosy outlook. Dioti himself felt confused. For days, he and other officers had promoted an optimistic view of the balance of forces. In order to boost morale, distress reigned in the Ethiopian camp. There was a shortage of food and internal divisions. Italian training would overcome Ethiopian numbers. Dioti hadn't known what to think, but in a personal sense, it hadn't mattered, as had he'd been assigned to the food detail and wouldn't be shooting at anybody. Then, toward the end of February, he was reassigned from the kitchens to combat duty. Suddenly, the prospect of battle was real. The Italian camps were on high ground. When the soldiers were ready, they descended to pass in review before General Baratieri and his staff. The Askari units as scouts took their lead. Dioti and his comrades watched in admiration as the Askari in the Dobromeda Brigade, officially known as the Native Company of Asmara, moved out smartly in their white pants and matching smocks with red embroidery on the shoulder. A woolen belt circled the waist, and a fez topped by a tassel completed the look. The Askari were in high spirits, laughing and chattering. Tassels bobbed as the Askari set out barefoot on the road to Adwa. As the other units fell into line, including Dioti's 14th Infantry Battalion, the order went around that they were to march in silence, without smoking, without flame, so as to pass undetected. General Albertone, encamped at a more westerly position, moved out a bit later. First, the 6th, 7th, and 8th Native Battalions took the lead, followed by Cordelia's 3rd Mountain Battery, along with 3 other artillery units. Each mountain battery group consisted of 4 artillery pieces, dismantled for transport and packed on mules. These were followed by ammunition caissons. In fact, not wagons but crates strapped on mules. There were 36 animals in all for each battery, carrying weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Nearly 70 soldiers, including 8 officers, rounded out each battery. By 9:45 that night, with the exception of support units, the entire Italian force was on the move. The night was enchanted. The sky was clear, the stars and full moon cast a silvery glow upon everything. For Giovanni Tedone, a soldier in a Bersaglieri unit in Arimondi's brigade, the moon was an immense streetlight. Giovanni Gamera, commanding a battalion of Ascari, recalled the cloudless, moonlit night as the most beautiful he'd ever seen, and he welcomed it as an auspicious sign. In spite of the good omens, the soldiers took every precaution. They marched without bayonets fixed for fear that the gleaming moonlight would reflect off the metal and give them away. Major Ludovico de Vito's Ascari battalion was out in front, serving as the eyes of the Dabrimida brigade. They stopped at 3 in the morning. Finally, at rest after 6 hours of marching, some battalions received orders to break out their reserve rations. The men had only a rough idea where they were, and the heavens above, the Southern Cross sparkled. Glancing around, a few veterans recognized the area near Yaha and its high peak, a local landmark. The rocky profile at Yaha, when marked by afternoon shadows, forms a lion's head, the proud outline of the Lion of Judah. There is no conclusive evidence to suggest that the Ethiopians had news of the Italian advance. However, there was some sympathy for what the Italian soldiers endured. Sometime after the events of March 1st, Ghebreyesus compared the dogged determination of the Italians to a kind of pilgrimage. They were loaded down for the entire night with a heavy pack on the back, a rifle on the shoulder, on the left hip an ammunition belt, on the right a water canteen, moving with difficulty in a strange land, like pilgrims to Lalibela. Albertone overshoots. The rugged mountains separating the town of Adwa from the Gundapta plains are barren in February, the end of the dry season in Ethiopia. 3 peaks from north to south, Shasho, Rayo, and Samayata, loom over the surrounding terrain. None is easy to overlook. Samayata is a classic symmetrical volcanic cone. Both Shasho and Samayata are 9,000 feet tall. At 8,000 feet, Rayo is not nearly as high, but it is unmistakable. Its gnarly, bulbous profile bears a passing resemblance to a walrus snout. Taken together, the 3 peaks define the surrounding geography. They serve as points of triangulation by means of which one can estimate distance and relative position for miles around. They are simply impossible to miss. The map Baratieri distributed to his generals was the creation of Major Tommaso Salsa. It was amateurishly drawn and a little short on verisimilitude. It bore only an approximate resemblance to the geography of the area. Even so, it got the main landmarks right. The 3 peaks of Shasho, Rayo, and Samayata were clearly drawn. The artist even inserted brackets to mark the passes between them. Baratieri's tactical concept was there on the page, and the objective was clear: march on the passes and occupy them. The left and right columns would take up their positions at the passes at about the same time, with a third column, commanded by General Arimondi, occupying the ground between, and the western flanks of Rayo. A fourth, reserve column would be stationed to the rear. As with any disposition of military forces, the alignment of units depended upon the lay of the land. Timing would be important. Should one of the columns arrive well in advance of the rest of the army, and should its presence be detected, fighting could break out before the Italian forces could take their positions. Security for the entire army depended upon establishing positions at the passes before the Ethiopians could react. Matteo Albertone, commander of Baratieri's left column, had a reputation for restlessness. It was a quality of the frustrations of the preceding weeks had only made worse. Since September of the previous year, Albertone and the rest of the army had prepared for a decisive encounter with Ethiopian forces that never seemed to arrive. The setbacks of Amba, Alage, and Megale had gone unanswered. Much of February had been lost to a war of positions. Albertone, like the other generals, was critical of Baratieri's extreme caution in the face of the enemy. Like the others, he began to believe that Baratieri feared a decisive encounter. Although the men under his command had doubts about his too impulsive general, Albertone had been given some of the best soldiers in the Italian army. These were the 4 all-Askari battalions, veterans of the victorious campaign against the Mahdi the year before. They were known for the energy and boldness. The speed of the Askari posed a challenge to the coordinated movements of the army. Baratieri was aware of the problem and ordered his generals to remain in communication. Baratieri was particularly concerned about General Albertone's Askari battalions. Baratieri took Albertone aside, warning him to proceed with caution and above all, not to push too far ahead. On the night of the move into the passes, Albertone's advance guard, the 1st Native Battalion, commanded by Major Domenico Turito, covered 10 difficult miles in under 3 hours, arriving at Gundapta at midnight. The pace was breathtaking. They were already halfway to their destination within 5 hours or so. With 5 hours to go. They waited at Gundapta for an hour until the rest of Albertone's column could catch up. Turito had a slightly nervous personality. His narrow-set eyes darted fretfully, glancing from his men toward the pass and back toward the approaching Albertone. Baratieri's plan called for him to wait at Gundapta until 2:30 in the morning before pushing on. But Turito was anxious to get going and insisted on leaving at 2 in order to be in position 3 hours later. By 3:30, Turito was already at the pass between Rayo and Samayata, the assigned rendezvous point for Albertone's column. Turito's Askari advance guard had needed only an hour and a half to cover the remaining distance to the pass. He waited. Half an hour later, the remainder of the column arrived. General Albertone approached Major Turito and asked the major why he had stopped. "This is Kidane Mehret," Turito answered, using the local name for the pass. Albertone argued with Turito. He told Turito that he was wrong and that the real Kidane Mehret was farther forward. Certainly the speed with which they reached their objective might have made them wonder if they had gone far enough. "Go ahead. I don't want any hesitation," Albertone barked. He fixed Turito with a glare, then asked, "You're not afraid, are you?" Albertone's bullying remark was all that was needed to end the discussion. Turito rounded up his men and headed down the slope toward the valley below. There were many errors contributing to the Italian disaster at Adwa, but Albertone's goading sealed the fate of the Italian advance, and indeed the Italian army. It would later be remarked in Albertone's defense that the place name confusion was real. Yet, it was Baratieri's explicit intent that his generals coordinate the occupation of the passes. The success of the operation depended on it. Although there was plenty of time, General Albertone did not seek clarification from General Baratieri or even bother to communicate with him. Although such routine and required communication would have forestalled disaster. But Albertone didn't foresee disaster. Albertone, Turito, and the 4,000 men under their command pushed through the pass and plunged onward toward Adwa. The descent from the passes is fairly steep, falling 300 feet in the first mile. Today, the northern pass is a dirt and gravel road wide enough for a lane, unmarked in each direction. On March 1st, 1896, it was barely half as wide, while the southern pass, the one Turito and Albertone took, was a footpath. With the slope now in their favor, it took only 30 minutes for the 950 men under Turito's command to descend from the pass and reach the point where the landscape begins to open out on the approach to the town of Adwa. Although there are still plenty of minor hills and peaks, some of them 600 feet or more above the valley floor, the confined spaces of the pass give way to rolling hills and broad valleys. By 5:30 in the morning, Turito and his men were abreast of the location Albertone had pushed them to occupy. All night they had marched by moonlight, but sunrise was 3/4 of an hour away, and the sky was showing the first signs of dawn. They were a mile and a half or so ahead of the rest of Albertone's column. Proper military procedure would dictate that they await the arrival of Albertone and the 3 other battalions to establish contact with the rest of the brigade. Instead, perhaps still driven by Albertone's stinging rebuke, they pushed on. They descended another 400 feet. In full daylight and with the aid of a pair of binoculars, they could have discerned the collection of huts and churches that made up the town of Adwa, due west. They would have been able to make out the thousands of Ethiopian tents in the Adwa plain and on the flanks of the mountain north of the town. Instead, in the damp yellow-blue light of dawn, they nearly walked into the middle of an Ethiopian camp. Startled Ethiopian sentries fired warning shots and took cover. It was a little after 6 in the morning. The Battle of Adwa had begun.